The Mets season may not be over, but their hopes at a division title certainly are. And if I'm recording a video at 8:06 a.m., you know that this means this is a big deal as to what's happening because it's also really early. That's why my face cam is not on today. But the Mets, after they tied up the game at 2 in the sixth inning, were completely embarrassed in the seventh and the eighth inning by the Philadelphia Phillies as their losing streak now hits 7. I don't want to say that the season is over, but any hopes at winning the division title at this point are practically done and dusted. Seeing as the Philadelphia Phillies are a red hot team. Phillies are a team that are 8-2 in their last 10 games. They're 8-2 in their last 10 games, and while they may have gotten swept by the Pirates, they are still a team that, even though they've been slumping before, now they're right back at it. They are the much better team. And the Mets, meanwhile, continue to prove themselves why they are nowhere near the playoffs, as their 7-game losing streak seemingly has no end in sight. As they have blown a 5.5 game division lead to follow second place in 8 days. That might be a record. That actually might be a record. And it's not like it's going to get any easier for the Mets because for anyone who wants to play the injury excuse, guess who the Phillies now have in the lineup? Perennial MVP candidate Bryce Harper was not in the lineup. You had Kemp playing first base, but it didn't matter as the Philadelphia Phillies just wrecked the Mets in the 10th as both Reed Garrett and Garza stunk up the whole place. It all started with back-to-back doubles, a walk and a single, then another single, take a 5-2 with no one out. After a flyout, there was another walk to load up the bases, and then Stott doubled and later wound up going to third base before the next two players got out, but by that point it was 8-2, and there was no hope for the Mets. There was also another 2-run home run of Garza from Nick Castellanos in the bottom of the 8th inning, just to add a bit of insurance for the Philadelphia Phillies. This is a game that, in the fourth looked pretty bleak for the Mets, but the Mets did get back-to-back home runs. But same person who hit a home run grounded into a double play in the first, and that was a big contributing reason for their loss. And this is, after all the other stuff that happened. The Mets choked away 2 very winnable games. This could have been just a normal 2-5 slump. Instead, it's a 7-game free fall. The Mets have already gone through a couple 2-5 periods that we'll discuss earlier. Those are the normal slumps that you can expect to happen over a baseball season. It is a long season, but most teams do not lose 7 in a row. The last time the Mets lost 7 in a row, June 2023. And as we know, that 7-game losing streak was a huge reason why their season got derailed. Last time they lost 8 in a row, got to go back to 2018, another year where the Mets finished with a losing record and did not make the playoffs. But before we do that, will the Mets losing streak hit 8 games? Well, it's not looking fun in a matchup predictor, as the Philadelphia Phillies have a 60% chance to win, as Abel has actually looked pretty good for the Philadelphia Phillies in his start, and as Griffin Canning has regressed significantly. The pitchers are a huge reason as to why the Mets are collapsing, and Griffin Canning in particular, his ERA was at 2.47, and then he got shellacked over his over 4 of his last 5 starts, with the only exception being throwing 6 scoreless against the Dodgers. But Griffin Canning allowed 6 and 4 1/3. He allowed 4 and 5 1/3. He allowed 3 earned runs and 5 total runs in just 3 innings against the measly White Sox. And in a rain-affected game, he allowed 3 and 2 2/3. So it's been ugly. And then you have Abel. Abel's a starter who has made 4 starts and has looked pretty good in each of his games. So this ain't going to be a fun matchup. After that, does it get any easier? I mean, I guess it gets easier. Because then it's Peterson versus Luzardo. But look, this game is the Mets' odds to win are only 51.3%, and there were several games this losing to they were favored to win. Their odds keep plunging down. Luzardo's ERA is also inflated by just a couple of bad starts. And the bullpen's untrustworthy, seeing as Peterson got a start, played magnificently, and then the bullpen blew that game in Atlanta. And Reed Garrett in particular, we have to have a conversation about Reed Garrett. Reed Garrett, in the month of June, has boasted an ERA of 11.57. His ERA was 1.23 before the game. It basically doubled to 2.45. And keep in mind that Reed Garrett was already, as it was, much worse than his ERA indicated. He had 14 holds, but, he had a 2-3 record as a pitcher. He had successfully, he successfully had 2 saves while blowing 4 saves. Blown save 1, he allowed a run to the Chicago Cubs in a game that they wound up winning because the Cubs just completely imploded in the bottom of the 8th, similar to what happened with the Mets, today in the 7th. The Cubs got this RBI double off of Garrett, but then Stana came in, pitched well, and then Hodge got shellacked by the Mets. Blown save number 2 came against the Pirates when he didn't allow an earned run, but he walked in a run, which is again why this why he was pitching better than pitching worse than his ERA indicated. He got the save against the Dodgers, and he got this save against the White Sox. And then this game against the Dodgers, he lost that game and blew the save. And then blew the save against the Braves in the game that they wound up losing, but we already know about that. In this game, by the way, just so that we know, Garrett pitched the 8th, and he pitched horribly in the 8th, and so the Dodgers took the lead, and he blew the save. But again, even though 3 runs, only one of them earned because of an error by Brett Beatty. That's why I say he's pitched a lot worse than his ERA indicated. His first loss that he earned came in this game against the Twins, where he allowed a walk-off single, runner on second. Didn't count against his ERA. It was still perfect at 0. But he still earned the loss nonetheless. He earned the win against the Yankees on the 17th. He loaded up the bases with 3 walks. But he got out of it without allowing a run. He lost this game against the Dodgers, won the game against the Nationals by pitching a perfect top of the 10th, and then lost this game against the Phillies in horrendous fashion. His ERA has gone up, it's almost quadrupled since the start of the month, and in particular, his ERA doubled based off of this game alone, which is not a good thing. And this Mets have deep problems in their lineup. Their ownership is just feeble, but I think now they're finally starting to clue in on what's happening. I'm actually deactivating my Twitter account until the Mets finally win a game. So I could be off Twitter for a very long time. Going back to what I was saying earlier about baseball is a long season and every team has slumps. The Mets were actually the last team to avoid losing back-to-back games doing so on April 15th and 16th against the Minnesota Twins, to fall from 11-5 to 11-7. Before that, the Mets did lose a series against the Astros, but they avoided losing back-to-back games against the Astros, and now a series loss to the Twins. Their first real slump, I'd say, came from April 30th through May 6th, this week of Mets baseball. They won the first game against the D-backs, 8-3, but then they lost the next two games against the D-backs. Beat the Cardinals in a game, but then the next game got rained out because of rain in St. Louis, and they lost the next two games. They got swept in doubleheaders to lose a series. Beat the D-backs on May 5th just to lose them on May 6th. That's a 2-5 stretch where they went from 21-9 to 23-14 during that time. So that's a 2-5 stretch. That's a bit of a slump, but this is kind of the slump that can really happen to any team in the in the MLB, and they still avoided losing 3 in a row. Then you have this slump. They were 28-15 before, and they fell to 30-21 after. They went both 1-5 and 2-6, losing the final game to the Pirates, losing a series to the Yankees, and then losing the first 2 out of 3 to the Red Sox before losing an ugly 13-inning affair to the Los Angeles Dodgers. Now, in this game is a little bit different because, number one, it was worse, and number two, the Mets finally lost 3 in a row. So, we saw that happen. The Mets offense just completely went cold during this time, and hitting with runners in scoring position was really exposed. Pitching was, for the most part, all right during the stretch, which made it even worse. But eventually, on May 21st, the offense came together against the Red Sox, which should have indicated an end to it, but then Mets did lose a game to the Dodgers subsequently. So, 2-5 stretch, which actually really was 1-5 and 2-6. So, again, that's a bad period. Mets lost a ton of ground. They blew the division lead, but then they were able to get it back. But here's what you have to understand. The entirety of May really was a rough period. I know the record says 15-12, but it's like August of 2024 in a way, and I'll show you why. In that, they had a bad month that isn't going to be really remembered as a bad month because they did well at the end, and the period is even worse because they struggled at the end of the previous month. The Mets, all the struggled. April 25th against the Nationals is where it started, when they came back down 3-0 just to blow the game and lose 5-4. And then when they blew a 7-1 lead against the Nationals 2 days later. But that stretch, they did go 3-2. So whether or not you say the slump started April 25th or April 30th is up to you. Because they were 18-7 before this period started, but then they were 21-9. Let's just say it started April 30th because it's a bit more dramatic, I think. Even though you take away a bit of the length variable. They finished at 30-21, which would indicate going 9-12 during that time. This wasn't a horrible period for the Mets. They did get series win against teams like the Cubs, who are pretty good. They also won a series against the Pittsburgh Pirates. They beat the D-backs on the road, even though they lost to them at home. But this is a bit of a rough period for the Mets. In total, they really, they choked away a 5-game lead in the division, but at least this was more slow-mo, where it's things were just, things just, for the most part, weren't going together. The offense was having problems, but, they were still occasionally winning games. They were still looking good at times. And if you include those previous 5 games into the mix, then instead of it being 9 and 9-12, it would go to 12 and 14, which on the one hand, 12 and 14 is better than 9 and 12, but on the other hand, it makes it so that it was for a longer period of time. The Mets could not pull together a win streak longer than 3 during this time. as well. They had a 7-game winning streak and a 6-game winning streak in April. Could not win more than 3 in a row during this time. Then the Mets do get 4 in a row twice, and then after a bit of a rough series against the Dodgers on the road, they do win 6 in a row. That's not only been erased now, but the entire good start to June has been erased, as the record is now 9-9. The sweep started by getting swept by the Rays at home. This is a blown 5-1 game. This is a blown 4-1 game. So 2 very winnable games that would have made it only 1-5, or really 2-5, if the Mets look competent. And now they're 45-31, so already at a worse position than when they were 39-24, with no end in sight for the Mets, as they seem to be unable to get a win. One of the things that made the Mets so good at the start is that they were unable to avoid super long losing streaks, and now they're in a catastrophically long one that threatens to derail their season, as they blew a 5.5-game division lead in 8 days to fall to second place. And furthermore, the Philadelphia Phillies are a team that historically the Mets have done well against. They beat the Phillies in the NLDS. They swept the Phillies earlier this year. The Mets have historically done well against the Phillies, and now they're losing to them at Citizens Bank Park. And I get that the Mets have a lot of players on the injured list, but the Phillies, again, former MVP Bryce Harper is not in the Phillies lineup. So there are no injury excuses. And the Mets, who have, looked feeble on the road at times, are showing that again, but they're also showing that their home field advantage is starting to really wear off, because at home was one of the few places where the Mets have done well. Alas, their season is going to be over very shortly. The Mets are free-falling fast. They were at one point at a 106-game winning pace. Now their winning pace has slowed to 96. And they at one point had at least a 7.5 game lead on a wild card. Their lead on the wild card has now shrunk down to just 4 games. They have a 4-game lead. They're now in the number 4 spot. The Brewers and Cardinals, they are catching up to the Mets right now. Soon the Mets will fall out of a playoff spot altogether, which would be horrible for obvious reasons. For obvious reasons, the Mets falling out of a playoff spot would just be horrible. Seeing where the season started, this would probably go down as the most embarrassing season in the history of the franchise of the Mets. And I'm not even really kidding when I say that. This would really be like the most embarrassing thing to happen to the Mets in franchise history. Because even though this roster is not one that has a chance of winning a championship, you had every opportunity to go out and get one. And Steve Cohen and David Stearns decided to not pursue a championship this year, to let their young kids play. The young kids are the ones dragging this entire team down, and they're blowing an opportunity, seeing as other teams are going to emerge as serious contenders in this time. I get 2024 not trying to pursue a championship, but by 2025, the Mets really had no choice but to pursue a championship, and they chose not to. And David Stearns' cockiness and wanting to prove he's the smartest manager is making him seem nothing better than an absolute idiot at the same time. Any hope that the Mets have of winning the division are liquidated. They could win the next 2 games, they still are not winning the division. They just aren't, because the Phillies tend to play their worst ball against the Mets, and now look at it. Now the Mets are so bad, the Phillies are destroying them, when usually the Phillies have a hard time against the Mets. Then the Mets have another 4-game series against the Braves. So that's not going to be fun. Mets are probably losing 3 out of 4, and there's a chance to get swept to extend their losing streak down to a catastrophically bad 13 games in a row. And obviously, if you lose 13 games in a row, your season's pretty much dead in the water. At that point, they're 45-37, so at that point they're 45-37. Yeah, good chance that they've lost their wild card spot entirely by that point. Or at least there's a semi-realistic chance they've lost their wild card spot. Um, you know, any hope of getting the 1 or 2 seed or winning the division is going to be completely blown by that point. And and as people have said, the Mets can get reinforced in the trade deadline, which they desperately need. But if the Mets can't even stay afloat during this time of injury, then it's going to be much harder for the Mets to make a big splash. Because the Mets might have to sell at the trade deadline if this keeps up, or their acquisitions will wind up being much smaller. They are getting Sean Manaea back late June, early July. That should help, but I don't even know if Sean Manaea can fix the deep, deep flaws of this team that are getting exposed right now. There is a possibility that the Mets don't are below 500 by the All-Star game, and they could win 3 games and still be below 500. Obviously, this would mean being 48-49 in the best case scenario, finishing below 500. So I doubt it, but either way, this could still be, the Mets could still wind up being, being significantly approaching the 500 mark and in free fall. And by the trade deadline, it's much more possible that the Mets could, if the Mets slump continues, that they fall below 500 or close to 500. At this point, there would be no choice. The Mets would have to sell the trade deadline. They could not buy. They'd have to abandon their championship hopes because you can't just continue to buy talent when you're that far out of it. Honestly, if the Mets fall out of it at all, I think they should sell. Because you were in it by such a large margin. You were the best team in baseball, and then you blew it like this. Like, you have to sell if you fall out of playoff position at all. The Mets didn't even fully buy the deadline in 2024 when it made a lot more sense to, seeing as their record at that point was 57-50, 56-50 at the deadline. The Mets were in a playoff position at this point. They had earned one on July 11th. They had stayed in one this whole time. They fell out of one in a slump as they had a 2-3 end to July and went on a 7-11 stretch that included losing a series to the pitiful Angels, getting swept by the Mariners, and losing a series to the pitiful Athletics, including losing 4 in a row and losing 5 of 6. But even that was still not as bad as what's going on with the Mets right now. That was still not as bad. Then you have this stretch where the Mets went 7-5, but to continue to get further out of the playoff picture, they went 13-15 during this whole stretch. Then this was erased by a 9-game winning streak for the Mets that put them right back in playoff position and put them in a position to, be serious contenders for the rest of the season. Seeing as for the rest of the season, at worst, the Mets would still be tied for a playoff spot. And the Mets wound up getting in anyway. But you have to think as to how this time around, what's happening for the Mets. And some of the acquisitions that Stearns got were horrible, but the Mets were able to overcome them that they ain't overcoming this time. And David Stearns is really getting exposed for being a terrible GM. And I don't think that the Mets are going to win a World Series until he is finally gone. Honestly, though, his firing may come sooner rather than later. Because if Steve Cohen really cares what the team is, what he says, and the Mets miss the playoffs, then both Steve Cohen and David Stearns will be fired immediately after the season. There are no excuses. This would be the most embarrassing season in Mets history, even knowing some of the other horrible collapses. Like 2007. Obviously, the Mets, went on a 5-12 stretch at the end of the season and blew a 7-game division lead to the Phillies. 2008. The Mets, again, showing a good September record, but they had a 3.5-game lead on the Philadelphia Phillies, and they blew it. Because in reality, we do some quick maths here. After September 10th, the Mets went 7-10. And honestly, 2008 might have hurt even worse in a way, seeing as the Phillies went on to win the World Series. 2021, a Mets collapse they like to bring up often. The Mets, start off 35-25. This time they actually did hold water through the trade deadline, seeing as they were still well above 500. But the Mets did not hold water later on in the season, as they continued to just lose pitiful game after pitiful game, minus a 7-game winning streak, finishing 77-85. Then we have, obviously, 2022 is a horrible one. 1998 is another one where the Mets, even showing a good September record, a mediocre September record, lost their last 5 games, missed the playoffs. 2025 is shaping up pretty much like that. Another historical collapse that the Mets, just to go down as another sting in the Mets history as to why they will not win a championship.